Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we're jumping right into some pretty unfiltered source material. It's a segment from an interview with Ted Nugent, the musician and commentator. The clip's actually titled, "Ted Nugent Calls Hillary a Bish Tag and Laughs at Stupid Anchor. So Funny." .mp3. So our mission here is basically to unpack the statements made in this interview. They're highly opinionated, quite provocative, and we want to give you a clear overview of what's being said and maybe how it's being said.
Exactly. And, this deep dive is really focused on understanding the arguments and, frankly, the communication style that Mr. Nugent uses here. We're aiming to help you consider all the different facets of this kind of public discourse, especially when it gets this heated. We're not taking sides on the content itself, obviously. We'll be looking at what he said, but also how he said it, and maybe what that tells us about these kinds of conversations in public life.
And believe me, quite a look at a very distinctive communication style. You're going to hear some incredibly direct language, very confrontational stuff. So yeah, let's unpack this together and see how this kind of raw rhetoric actually works out there. Okay, first up, his political takes and his socioeconomic critiques. He starts off strong, calling what he terms the Obama manifesto, waving the white flag, a surrender. That sets a tone, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. A very high-stakes tone, almost like, existential conflict right from the get-go. And what's fascinating, I think, is how he often anchors these big political points in, well, personal experience or local examples, like how he brings up Detroit and Michigan. He calls it a case study in liberal Democrat policies being forced upon a once great state. That's not just an abstract economic point. It's a way to make it feel very real, very visceral for people listening, taking a perceived failure and pinning it directly on an ideology.
And he really gets specific, doesn't he? He claims Obama, quote, cut off funding for our troops while they were fighting. And even that, Obama accused him of air raiding villages and killing civilians. Flip. The economic stuff claims Obama wanted to nationalize health care, raise taxes on corporations and the capital gains. But the interviewer doesn't just, let those statements lie there.
No, definitely not. For instance, on the troop funding point, the interviewer jumps in, right? They point out that Obama's vote against funding was tied to a bill that included a timeline for withdrawal. But Nugent immediately twists that, doesn't he? He reframes it as Obama hating the troops, which is, well, it's a powerful rhetorical move. Shifts from a policy detail to this broad accusation of personal animosity towards the military.
Right. And while those political points are pretty stark, maybe the most defining feature of this interview is the language he uses. It's incredibly direct, very provocative. Let's maybe get into that communication style a bit. I mean, he's quoted saying about Obama, "Hey, Obama, you might want to suck on one of these, you punk," talking about his gun, followed by, "He's a piece of blank. I told him to suck on my machine gun." And then there's the comment about Hillary Clinton. "You said Hillary's a B word. Let her suck on this." Just wow.
And then he tries to give it some context, referencing the comedian Sam Kinison with the guitar. Kinison was known for that really aggressive, confrontational style. Nugent says, "Everybody I know gets the joke." This kind of supercharged language, it often does a few things at once in public discourse. It's designed to shock, obviously, grab attention, but it can also act as a kind of rallying cry for its specific group, like a tribal signal. For the people who are already with him, getting the joke reinforces that connection, signals his maybe authenticity to them, while drawing a really clear line between us and them.
Yeah, but the interviewer clearly does not seem to get the joke. They challenge him directly on it, asking, "Is this what you want to teach your kids?" And you can hear the disbelief when they say, "That's really funny material, really." It just throws that clash of styles into sharp relief, the gap between his intended audience and maybe a broader public.
It really shows how polarizing language like that can be. What one group might see as, I don't know, edgy or funny, another finds deeply offensive or irresponsible. And that's a dynamic we see a lot in public conversations today, isn't it?
Definitely. Now, that same kind of forceful, clear-cut approach also comes through in his views on security and conflict. He's quoted from his book saying, "Each morning you bow down to the Almighty and pray for good bombing weather." And when asked, "Who would Jesus bomb?" his answer is just incredibly direct. He says, "We love bombing tyrants and desperates and slave drivers. We love killing bad guys so that innocent lives can be saved."
Yeah, and expanding on that, he mentions wanting to bomb specific figures like Mugabe. It clarifies that perspective further. It's a very black and white view of global conflict, isn't it? Aggressive action as the necessary solution. It kind of simplifies these really complex geopolitical situations down to good guys versus bad guys with a clear, decisive answer.
And that same sort of black and white thinking seems to apply to border security, too. He's confronted with a statement, apparently suggesting anyone who illegally comes into the country to shoot them, right? Nugent clarifies it, though. He says, if they're armed and they're attacking our country, yep. He goes on to say that if people are making an unauthorized entry armed like they are right now invading our country, he would shoot them dead. And an interviewer just repeats, like, stunned, just shoot them dead.
Yeah, that specific wording around border security and using lethal force, it's quite something. The key thing there, rhetorically, is using words like attacking and invading to describe people crossing the border. That language frames the whole situation as an act of war, which then, in his logic, justifies these extreme measures. It really pushes you, as a listener, to think about the implications of advocating for responses like that to what are, fundamentally complex social and political problems.
Okay, now shifting gears a little, but still sticking with strong opinions.
Yeah.
Personal accountability, specifically public health. Mr. Nugent apparently argues that parents of overweight kids who have blubber or bad hygiene should be charged with neglect. The interviewer immediately pushes back on that, saying something like, so the government decides your kid's fat and you go to jail. Really, you want more government involvement.
And what's really interesting is Nugent's reaction to that direct question about government involvement. He says, no, not at all, which seems contradictory, right? He tries to reframe it. He talks about a sense of accountability that he sees in his own family, his hunting buddies, people who conduct themselves in a responsible fashion.
Right, and then he connects that idea of personal responsibility directly to public health costs. He says something like, there is a pandemic of healthcare overload right now because people don't care about their health. And certainly obesity is at the source of this pandemic of wasted tax dollars paying for healthcare.
Yeah.
So he's making a clear link. Personal health choices, obesity, healthcare costs, taxpayer money.
And that just highlights this fascinating tension, doesn't it? On one hand, he's calling for this extreme individual accountability. But the solution he proposes, charging parents with neglect, well, that would mean more government intervention, wouldn't it? Even though he explicitly says he doesn't want that. It kind of invites us to think about where individual responsibility ends and, societal structures or government roles begin, especially with public health. It's that classic debate, really individual liberty versus the collective good, just framed in a very, very provocative way.
Absolutely. And, throughout this whole thing, you can't ignore the interviewer's role. It's not just a Q&A. It really feels like a confrontation, like a verbal sparring match at times. The interviewer isn't just letting him talk. They are actively pushing back, challenging the statements, often with this tone of disbelief, asking questions that seem designed to point out the implications, maybe even the absurdity of some of his claims.
Exactly right. The interviewer is a really active participant here, not just a facilitator. They're constantly trying to clarify, to push back on those more extreme statements, which is pretty vital when you're dealing with rhetoric this strong. And they even get personal at the end, right? Saying something like, I don't live in a TED state, so I guess I'm okay. And mentioning preferring to hunt with Cheney. It just shows how direct and personal the whole exchange became. It sort of blurs the line between a standard interview and a head-to-head debate. It's actually a pretty good example of an interviewer really pressing for clarity and for the consequences of the words being used.
Wow. Okay. So we've definitely covered some intense ground there. From those sharp political critiques and the very provocative language to some really strong views on violence, borders, and even personal health accountability. It was certainly a lot to unpack from one interview segment.
It really was. And maybe this leaves you, our listener, with an important question to ponder. When you encounter public discussions like this one, full of strong rhetoric, confrontational dialogue, deeply held convictions mixed with provocative language, how do you navigate that as an informed listener? What does an exchange like the one we've just explored tell us about how ideas get presented, how they're received, and ultimately how they're debated in the wider public sphere today? Something to think about.